Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about What's Your Roadman? Critical essays on Jack Kerouac's On the Road. So what this book is, it's a series of 10 different essays that talk about On the Road. It gives a full overview of On the Road, its history, its cultural impact, just everything it has to do with On the Road. This book definitely gives you a full overview of what On the Road represents. And I'm not going to do a review of or talk about each essay specifically. I'm just going to kind of give an overview of what the main points I took away throughout reading all of these essays and what was most interesting to me, and really focusing on things that I hadn't necessarily talked about in other videos that I've done so far on the Beat Generation, On the Road, Jack Kerouac. But what this book makes very clear is that Jack Kerouac never wanted to be this cultural icon. He never wanted to be this person who represents the rejection of the establishment. He just wanted to be a traditional American writer. But his writing style was just so unique that he never was going to be seen as just a traditional writer. He was going to be this figure that just redefined writing, redefined America. And that's not what he wanted, but it's what he became. And Jack Kerouac as a person or as a writer never really moved on from On the Road in the eyes of popular culture. Jack Kerouac is On the Road. On the Road is Jack Kerouac. That's just what he's seen as, for better or for worse. And On the Road it's this cultural watershed moment, the publication of On the Road. So, it's fitting in a sense that he's remembered for this book, because this is the book that really changed America, really kickstarted the counterculture movement in the late 1950s, early 1960s. But getting back to the book, throughout these 10 essays, I think the three major topics that it seems to go back to are the ideas of culture, race, and class. They're just three very central themes throughout On the Road. But I want to start by talking about how On the Road represents culture in the 1950s. 1950s America, as this book describes, is really, there's two main cultural ideas that really define 1950s. The idea of freedom and the idea of containment. America was really opening up during the 1950s. You have the old highway system that was built after World War I. In 1956, the interstate system began being built. So the country is really just opening up during this time. You had all these different roadside services, diners, gas stations, motels were just popping up all over the country. And this idea of the family vacation was really starting to begin in the 1950s. So this idea of freedom just defined the 1950s. This idea of mobility, this idea to just move around the country. And the other idea that really defined the 1950s was the idea of containment. Containment during the Cold War represented suppressing communism, suppressing the spread of communism around the world. But as much as containment was an international idea with stopping communism and spreading to different countries, it had a lot of impact internally in America. Americans were really afraid of communism, and because of this fear of communism, there was a growing fear of outsiders, a fear of roads in general. People were very afraid of roads. Roads were seen as a very mysterious place, a very dark thing. And the idea of containment in the 1950s also represented defending traditional American values during the 1950s. And one of the essays in this book argues that On the Road exists at the crossroads of both the ideas of freedom and the ideas of containment. And that's kind of the America that Jack Kerouac lives in. And during the 1950s, the highway system was really starting to take root. People were given the ability to move around the country very freely, and this ability for free movement also worked very well for the idea of containment, because the ability to move around very freely helped to consolidate American culture, helped to consolidate this idea of consumerism throughout the whole country. Because the ability to travel around the country, to go to different cities, stay in motels, all these roadside attractions, it's just pure American consumerism. And that was starting to develop at this time. But in the same sense, this idea to move around the country very freely also allowed for a lot of internal mixing. And a lot of people felt very vulnerable about this idea, because America before World War II was a place, a very regional place. Different regions have their own culture. And the interstate system that allowed different regions to come in contact with each other very, very easily. So a lot of conservative parts of the country who didn't like people from other parts of the country be able to come to their area very freely. And this is the time when the civil rights movement started to take off. So there's a lot of tension in America now that people are able to just freely move around the country in a way that they were never able to before the Second World War. And the character Dean Moriarty in On the Road, who's based off the real life Neil Cassidy, represents this idea of freedom in its most pure form, because he's someone who, his character in the book was said to have been born on the road, and he just kind of travels in the country, mixes with different races and cultures, and he's a character who's bisexual. So he also is redefining what sexuality and gender means during this time period. He's just the pure embodiment of freedom, not freedom in the sense of the American idea of freedom, just pure freedom and just being able to move around freely and be whoever he wants to be freely, and just kind of redefining identity during the 1950s. And the character Sal Paradise in On the Road, who's based off Jack Kerouac, he kind of looks at Dean, as he kind of idolizes him and wants to be like him, wants to live this life of freedom that Dean lives. But by the end of the book, Sal is someone who's very disillusioned with his time on the road, very disillusioned with Dean. Sal kind of abandons him at the very end of the novel. And Sal kind of, in the story, kind of chooses this life of, this very stable life at the end. He's with his new wife, living in New York City. He's not this person who's living on the road like Dean is still doing at this point. So in a sense, Sal kind of chooses this life of containment in the very end of the book, even though throughout the whole book he's searching for this idea of freedom. Because Jack Kerouac is really someone who valued family life. Even though he was traveling around the country, I feel like he was always searching for a place where he could be stable, a place where he could settle down. He never quite found that. He's always going back to his mother throughout his life. And he's always searching for a very stable life, even though his life is very chaotic and he's always traveling around the country. And even though Jack Kerouac never really quite settled down in real life, the character in this book, the character Sal Paradise, he kind of chooses a very normal life at the very end. But he just kind of exists at this crossroads of freedom and containment. And this book also does a lot of analysis of the ideas of race and On the Road, because On the Road is also a very controversial novel when it comes to race. And I think that's rightfully so, that it's controversial, because Jack Kerouac kind of projects his desire for kicks and joy and music. He projects it onto minorities, and he kind of looks to minorities to find that. He always talks about in this book how he wishes he was a black person, wishes he was a Mexican American. And I think by looking at race in those terms, it really minimizes the reality of their lives, because being a black person in America in the 1950s wasn't a very easy life. It was a very difficult life. There was a lot of trouble in their lives, and Jack Kerouac kind of looks at their lives as being something he can explore and get new experiences out of. And this ability to go around America and explore different cultures, explore different races very freely, isn't something that was available to all different races. Only white people during this time were able to do that. Only they could go about freely and travel around America, because it just wasn't possible for black people to do that. It was just a very segregated country where there was a lot of hate, a lot of racism was still very much a thing. So Jack Kerouac was very privileged to be able to do that in the first place. And I think one event in On the Road that really highlights this, and one of the essays in this book talks about it, there's this time where Jack Kerouac's living with this Mexican-American woman. He was traveling around with her, this woman named Terry. And at the end of his travels with her, his mother, or in the book, Sal's aunt sends him money to be able to travel back to New York. And Terry's just kind of left there with all of her difficulties with her family. So I think that really highlights how Jack Kerouac was able to go out and experience all these different cultures and races in America. But he talks about how much he kind of glorifies different cultures who don't have as many advantages as white people had during this time period. And at the same time, his aunt sent him money. He's able just to go back home and kind of leave all these troubles behind that Mexican Americans were able to just leave behind, the way that Sal Paradise was in the book. So in this way that Jack Kerouac uses race to extract authenticity, extract meaning in his life, one of the essays in this book describes it as a form of poaching, where it's just kind of taking different cultures, different races, and finding what you like about them, and using that to find value, meaning in your own life. And by doing this, by looking at race as something where you look for adventure and different music and different things that bring you joy in life, it's kind of looking at race as a performance thing, where he's kind of taking these ideas, these images of what he thinks certain groups of people are, taking these stereotypes and going out and seeking those stereotypes to find meaning and joy in his life. So On the Road really, I think, represents a lot of stereotypical idealism when it comes to race. And Kerouac also takes this, the way that he looks at race and also applies it to other aspects of American culture. He looks at the American West in a very similar way, because when he goes out west, he talks a lot about cowboys and just kind of outlaws in the very old West. So he looks at, I think, a lot of people in the West through this lens as well, of all these stereotypes of what he thinks it should represent and what it should be, and just looks for that in people. So I think a lot of the criticism of Jack Kerouac is that he's just very naive in the way that he looks at America, the way he looks at different people. And, at the same time that he's naive, he looks at America in a very childlike lens. I think that's why people really like Jack Kerouac, because he analyzes things in a very childlike manner. And, that works well in some places. But when it comes to race, it kind of just makes him look naive and kind of overlooks a lot of the, advantage that he has that other people don't necessarily have. And Jack Kerouac even directly addresses this in On the Road. He talks about how he has this disillusionment with white America, how he's just kind of disillusioned with, this idea of 1950s America, everyone moving to levee towns. He just doesn't really fit in with that idea, because he's a very marginalized person throughout his life. He kind of comes from this French Canadian background, so never quite feels American in America. So he kind of finds, I think, comfort in marginalized groups of people, which happened to be, at the time, different races in America. So he kind of felt at home amongst different races. But, at the same time, he's still a very privileged person, just by the fact that he's white in America during the 1950s. And this book touches very briefly on what African Americans thought about On the Road when it came out. And it talks about Eldridge Cleaver, his thoughts on The Road, because Eldridge Cleaver was the person who, I believe he was the founder of the Black Panthers, or a very prominent person in the Black Panthers. And he saw On the Road as a book that represented social progress. It represented a step in the right direction. But for other African Americans during the time, On the Road is a very controversial novel, where some people don't like it, some people do like it. It's kind of mixed feelings when it comes to, On the Road for, the perspective of different minorities who read the book during that time period. But what I think On the Road really represents when it comes to race in America, it represents that very first step. It represents that desire to want to go out and connect with other people, to go out and discover other cultures in America. Because America was a very closed place during the 1950s. People lived in their bubbles. There was never going to be change unless people were willing to go out and go experience and go explore other parts of America. Because America was a very regional place before World War II. It was a place of many different regions. There was places that spoke purely French, and there were places that were very segregated when it comes to race. But after World War II, America is really moving on from this place of different regions that were very closed off from each other to this kind of rural-urban divide that we see today. People were really starting to move around the country, and I think when it comes to race, it started to shift to this rural-urban divide in America, where inner cities were primarily made up of minorities, and a lot of rural areas were mostly white people. And Jack Kerouac kind of represents America starting to break these boundaries that really started to change in the 1960s. And at the same time that I think Jack Kerouac ultimately was probably a positive force in making change in America, he still saw America from this white working class perspective that he had. And because of that, On the Road just not going to age very well when it comes to race. It's just very naive, because Jack Kerouac just didn't know any better. He didn't really know, what other parts of the country were. So he looked at other races in a very naive way, in a very childlike way. And these ideas, even though they're very controversial, had a big influence on in the 1960s on the hippies, who were people who were very focused on social change. So even though it didn't age very well, and Jack Kerouac is a very naive person, it did have a positive impact. It did influence a lot of social change. It was just the very start of it. And because it was the very start, it still was a very conservative way of looking at race in America. And in addition to Jack Kerouac kind of walking this very fine line between different cultures and different races in America, he also did the same thing when it came to class in America. Because Jack Kerouac, he travels very cheap. He just kind of hitchhikes and travels to go see friends. He doesn't travel to tourist attractions. He doesn't stay in motels. He kind of avoids this capitalist consumerism that was in America during that time. And it's not necessarily that he was an anti-capitalist, someone who wanted to overturn capitalism. He just kind of evaded capitalism. He evaded, consumerism during the 1950s. And this book talks about how whenever there's time periods in history when there's a lot of conformity, there tends to be a group of peoples who kind of evade ideas of class. Especially in France, it talks about after after the era of the French Revolution. There were these bohemians in France who kind of lived outside of class, lived outside of politics, and didn't quite fit this idea of conformity during their time period. And the 1950s are the same thing. The Beat Generation represents people not necessarily fitting in with ideas of class and race and culture in America. Because Jack Kerouac, he's neither a capitalist or Marxist in the way that he looks at the world. Because both capitalists and Marxists outlook on culture and society, they see history as this story of progress, a story moving in a certain direction. People like the Beat Generation, people like the Bohemians in France, they really live outside of this story of history, this story of progress. They're people who really live outside of the margins of social class. And they tend to be artists and criminals and just people who don't really fit in, because Jack Kerouac, he himself is an artist who describes America in a very artistic way, but he's also describing people who are very ragged and poor, and people who are criminals, and he finds comfort and joy in the underbelly of society. And that's just a very bohemian way of looking at the world, looking at society. People like that, they kind of swap capitalist success for self-determination. They're just more focused on finding meaning in their own life and finding meaning within society. And one of the essays towards the end of this book talks about this novel titled The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. It talks about how this novel was very similar to On the Road. And The Bell Jar it's not a beat novel. It's not written by a beat author, but it takes place during the same time period. It takes place during the 1950s. It was written during the 1950s. And the book deals with the main character feeling very alienated from society, not fitting in, a search for meaning in life. And that's basically the same thing that Sal Paradise does in On the Road. And I felt that the essay was a little weird. It kind of just seemed to go on and on, describing all the similarities between these two books. And as you're reading, you're kind of like, okay, where is this going? But at the very end of the essay, it kind of makes the argument that it wasn't just the Beat Generation that was writing about these kind of ideas of alienation in 1950s America. So it kind of describes how there was a much broader literary movement than just the Beat Generation itself. A lot of people were writing about these ideas of not fitting in with 1950s America. And in my opinion, I think it goes even beyond writing itself. A lot of artists like Jackson Pollock or Robert Frank, people who just kind of try to redefine art during this time period, represent this alienation within mainstream society, mainstream art. Because I think the most prominent theme in On the Road is Sal Paradise struggling with identity. He really struggles with discovering who he is. And I think that that's just a side effect of 1950s conformity. Some people just did not fit in with mainstream society. And 1950s was such an era where the conformity was such a central theme in popular culture. And I think On the Road really just causes the reader to really ask, what is America? Who am I? What does age mean? What does love mean? What does sexuality mean? And it just kind of, it just asks these fundamental questions about, what is identity during the 1950s? And Jack Kerouac talks quite a bit about death throughout On the Road and many of his novels in general. And I think that the reason he talks about death so much is that he just saw the world as a place of decay. He just saw society as a place that was going a very wrong direction. I think that just had to do with this idea of conformity, just people trying to be like everyone else. And he saw that as a very dark thing. And because he lived in this very dark place in his mind because of that, he just thought quite a bit about death throughout his life. And one of the last essays in this book talks about why On the Road is so popular today. Why is it still so popular decades and decades after it came out? And one of the reasons that it mentions for that is because On the Road is a very performance-based book. It's a performance of Jack Kerouac's life. And because it's such a performance-based book, it feels very real. It feels like you're having a conversation with him as you read it. And it compares On the Road to a book like The Great Gatsby, which is also written in first person. But On the Road just feels like such a more personal book than The Great Gatsby, because Kerouac kind of established a relationship with the reader as he writes his novel, as he reads to you. Because it's just kind of written as spontaneous conversation. It's not written in a very formal way, the way other novels were written in America before On the Road. And because of that, it just stands out as being very unique, and it just kind of draws the reader in. And there hasn't really been too many writers like Jack Kerouac, since Jack Kerouac wrote all of his novels throughout his life. And several of the essays in this book talk about different versions of On the Road that were written from the first draft in 1951 up until the published version in 1957. And it talks a lot about the writing process of On the Road, about how he wrote the first draft on his scroll. And it just kind of goes on and on about everything that went into writing On the Road. And it's something that I've read about quite a bit. So reading this book, it kind of just felt like beating a dead horse, because going on and on and on about it. But I think what that really represents, because you don't really, when you talk about different novels written throughout American history, there's not really any novel I can think of that's analyzed the same way that On the Road is. Like, what novel do you think about when you think about the different drafts that are written, the process of writing it? It's just something very unique to On the Road. I think what that represents is that On the Road, it's something the book On the Road is larger than the book itself. The story isn't just the story in its book itself, because On the Road is such a watershed moment in American history that the book has a life that's bigger than the book itself. And the very last essay in this book talks about the process of trying to turn On the Road into a movie. And this book was published a couple years before the movie On the Road came out in 2012. It definitely has a very unique perspective on the process of turning into a movie, about how people thought it was a book that could never be turned into a movie. And even as soon as the book came out in 1957, people were immediately trying to turn it into a movie. And there was many attempts to write a script for it, and many attempts to find people to play different characters in the story, and never really materialized. And it's just a very difficult book to turn into a movie. And the story of that, how it's such a difficult process, that's just very representative of On the Road, because everything about On the Road is very complex, and the story of it being created, the story of it being written. So it makes sense that the story of turning into a movie was also a very complicated thing. I think it just really represents that On the Road is much bigger than the story. It just represents this moment of change in America, this moment of change in pop culture, where everything was different after this book came out. And I think that On the Road is really, it's kind of this cultural event horizon, where once the book came out, once America was introduced to this idea of the Beat Generation, this idea of traveling around America, this idea of being spontaneous, America was never going to be the same after that. It really just represented counterculture really taking off in America. And popular culture was never the same after On the Road came out. So yeah, that's my thoughts after reading What's Your Road, Man? Definitely would recommend it. It really just looks at On the Road from all different angles and gives you a full analysis of it. And I definitely took a lot away from reading this. So yeah, that's What's Your Road, Man? Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next book review.